This morning we have a hearing on a very important issue with regard to our critical supply chains, and I appreciate our witnesses being here with us to share your wisdom. We will introduce you after our opening remarks. Trade has the ability to increase productivity, incomes, and the availability of goods. While we talk often about how increased supply and choice of goods that come from international trade benefit our consumers, we sometimes forget that this also benefits our producers. In fact, a majority of what we import each year is reinvested into more manufacturing, processing, and farming activity. Efficient and reliable supply chains help American businesses, farmers, and workers expand their production and focus their resources on the high-value aspects of industry. This is the issue we must be wary about is when supply chains turn unreliable, in particularly because they are controlled by countries that refuse to follow free market rules, such as China. As we are all aware, China continues its march toward expanding control over key resources and goods, and thus over the world's supply chains. For example, advanced semiconductors increasingly rely on the rare earth mineral dysprosium, 99% of which comes from China. This is not an isolated case where China has dominance over a strategic resource. China controls over 90% of global processing for rare earths and 70% for cobalt, which is used in batteries for electric cars, smartphones, and other components. The way China uses trade and investment to expand its control over resources outside its own borders is also particularly concerning. Indonesia has 40% of the world's reserves for nickel, the largest of any single country. Yet Chinese firms control about 75% of Indonesia's nickel refining capacity. We need to take a hard look at the reality of our situation and develop an aggressive strategy to counter China. Our domestic policies are at fault in some instances. There are things we can produce efficiently here, but burdensome and unnecessary regulation stalls development of many important projects. We should not have to learn from another economic shock like the oil embargo of the 1970s to realize where we have the resources or potential for investment, it must be unleashed. Both sides of the aisle agree that we need a strong semiconductor industry. In Asia, new semiconductor fabs are being built and deployed in under 3 years. In the United States, the semiconductor industry, one of the safest manufacturing sectors for workers, must contend with a myriad of permitting measures that provide only marginal, if any, benefit. And these permits guarantee increased delays and costs, often adding years to projects. As a part of its economic policy, the Trump administration has prioritized deregulation as a means to drive economic growth, and I look forward to working with them to rationalize our regulatory system. In many other cases, geography and geology do not provide the United States with all the natural resources that we require. Here, the fault rests mainly with the failure to develop an affirmative trade policy. An affirmative trade policy ensures our consumers and manufacturers have access to the resources that our nation needs to be secure and independent. Here, for example, the Trump administration was correct to exempt Canadian potash, a key nutrient for our corn and soy farmers, from recent tariffs. Another key to the administration's economic approach is to renegotiate global trade deals, including deals that reclaim America's lead over China. Critically, these deals will be particularly useful in strengthening supply chains if they improve market access opportunities. Our trading partners must respect American investment and afford it the same treatment given to their own companies. Our partners must also realize that it bolsters their security when they do not inhibit access to cutting-edge American technology, like our state-of-the-art medical devices. Unfortunately, a number of trading partners use price controls, technology theft, weak intellectual property protections, or unreasonable government procurement policies to keep these devices out of their markets. Such actions only undermine the health of their own citizens while leaving a strategic opening for China. Today we have an opportunity to consider these issues carefully. Our four witnesses are experts on industries critical to America's economic security. We should encourage thoughtful debate on how to advance a trade policy that strengthens the security of our supply chains and creates opportunities for all Americans. I'd like to now turn to Senator Wyden for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And our committee is back again to assess Donald Trump's trade policy. And I'd like to say it's not exactly a command performance. Our country is now stuck in an endless trade cycle that Donald Trump has no idea how to escape. What happens is Donald Trump makes big threats. Then he imposes massive tariffs. Then, after there's a huge outcry from American farmers, investors, and families, Donald Trump caves in. And that starts the chaos all over again, having accomplished virtually nothing except damaging Americans' sacred credibility. With all this thrashing around, we're still worse off today than we were before Donald Trump took office, and this was documented this morning in several press articles. Prices are higher. Supply chains are in disarray. And nobody can feel very confident about what the rules will be in 3 months or what markets will still be slammed to our exporters. So just for a moment, I'll reflect on the much ballyhooed trade deal Donald Trump announced with China. After lots of bluster, the end result is Donald Trump has put an additional 30% tax on everything Americans buy from China. That's still one of the biggest tax increases on working families ever enacted. In return, Donald Trump got a promise to have more talks sometime in the future. In other words, America got nothing. Meanwhile, real people in America have been harmed by Trump's game of chicken. Trump's tariffs are increasing or threatening supply chains for all kinds of essential industries, including healthcare. When the supply chain for medicine fails, people are going to die. Our farmers and ranchers who absolutely have to sell their ag products overseas have been having trouble finding ships to take their crops. The Port of Portland in my home state saw a 51% decrease in exports, according to trade statistics just released. And I know my friend Senator Cantwell, who's one of our trade experts, is very concerned about this. The Port of Tacoma is a major hub for sending soybeans to Asia. They've seen a 28% decrease, according to these recent statistics. So it is ironic that some of the companies that invested most heavily in their North America supply chains have been hit the hardest by the Trump trade chaos. U.S. automakers say Trump's fumbling on trade is going to cost them billions of dollars this year alone and raise car prices for consumers. Ford predicts $1.5 billion in losses. GM predicts $5 billion in losses. Toyota, which employs more than 60,000 people in America, forecasts 20% of its revenue is going to evaporate. It's only a matter of time before companies hemorrhaging profits start to cut jobs. The latest estimate with China is not going to do a thing to reverse the damage Donald Trump caused to the auto industry. In fact, his deal with the United Kingdom last week may make things worse. Donald Trump gave a massive gift to British car companies by setting the tariff on their cars to 10% compared to 25% for Canadian autos and parts. Donald Trump justified lowering the tariff because Rolls-Royces and Bentleys, in his words, are super luxury, unquote. So Donald Trump's deal means less taxes on cars for the ultra-wealthy and higher taxes on cars that working families drive here in America. Now, I voted for the bipartisan U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement in Donald Trump's first term because in this room, colleagues, Democrats and Republicans worked together for months to put together a bipartisan proposal. And we were able, and I think Senator Crapo remembers this, we won the votes of senators who had never voted for a trade agreement because we put in all that time to work together. And so it shows you can make progress in a bipartisan way if you want to. This time around, the only option on offer is tariffs. Trump's tariffs are causing price hikes for cars, coffee, electronics, warnings of possible toilet paper shortages, and layoffs in trucking and medical device manufacturing right now. All over the world, those who have been reliable trading partners with our country are saying not anymore. He's making the world's supply chains more reliant on China. So to make progress on trade and manufacturing, this committee worked extensively on the CHIPS legislation and clean energy. Donald Trump is breaking that model and hitting people with more costs that make manufacturing in America again harder. We passed tax credits for Made in America manufacturing in factories that will make essential energy and computing products right here in America. Unfortunately, as of this morning, the Trump administration is in the process of tearing that down. Donald Trump's cuts to research and science funding are a huge own goal that hurts domestic manufacturing and threatens innovative industries like semiconductors and development of new medical treatments. So I very much look forward to our witnesses this morning, and what I want to know more than anything is your ideas for getting America off this merry-go-round with respect to trade. It starts with the threats and goes forward with the steps I outlined. Let's get off that merry-go-round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. I would just state that I just checked, and the stocks are higher today again. The S&P climbed at 0.2% already and has now advanced into the green for the entire year. And the fact is that we're starting to see renewed interest in taking down trade barriers and opening up more access for trade. I hope we can build on it.
I won't belabor this, Mr. Chairman. I will just say that there were several articles this morning that described how we are in many times worse shape today than we were on day one of the Trump administration. I'd ask unanimous consent that I could put that set of articles in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Maybe we'll add a couple of the other articles
I think that's
as well.
fair.
Thank you very much. We both look very much forward to the testimony that our witnesses will provide to us today. These issues are critical to Republican and Democrat members of this committee on many levels. And I thank our witnesses for being here. Our witnesses today will be Scott Whitaker, President and CEO of the Advanced Medical Technology Association, AdvaMed, Dr. Gracelin Baskaran, did I pronounce that right? Director of Critical Minerals Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, David Issacs, Vice President for Government Affairs at the Semiconductor Industry Association, and Caleb Ragland, President of the American Soybean Association. With that, I ask our witnesses to please follow your 5-minute clock in front of you as you make your statements so that we can have opportunities to interact with you. And we will begin with Mr. Whitaker.
Chairman Crapo and Ranking Member Wyden, thank you for the opportunity to testify before this committee on such an important topic. I'm Scott Whitaker. I'm the President and CEO of AdvaMed. We're the MedTech Association, which represents the industry that invents, manufactures, and distributes technologies to every hospital, health clinic, and doctor's office in America. We're an American success story and the global superpower of medical innovation. Think about our industry this way: the diagnostic test, the X-ray, the MRI, the CAT scan, and the ultrasound, heart valves and heart pumps, cardiac monitors, stents and pacemakers, the artificial hip, artificial knee and shoulder, the insulin pump and the continuous glucose monitor, surgical kits that are used every day for 77,000 procedures in the United States, and now the imaging exam powered by AI, which according to a recent study improves breast cancer detection by more than 29%. These are the products and many more that the medtech industry manufactures. And I suspect everyone in this room has had direct experience with one or more of these life-saving technologies. As we think about trade policy and supply chains, it's essential that this industry is protected from tariffs for humanitarian reasons, as it historically has been. To be clear, we applaud the President's efforts to bring more manufacturing back to the United States and fix some of the existing trade imbalances. But the reality is up to 70% of medtech used in America is already made in America, supporting 3 million jobs across this country, and that's growing every day. The U.S. is the largest medtech market in the world, accounting for 40% of global sales. And it's unquestionably the global leader in innovation. If there's a breakthrough in medical technology, chances are it was developed right here. Tariff policy, if deployed in the wrong way, could put all of that at risk, and here's why. First, medtech products are mandatory, not optional. They can mean the difference between life and death, which is why they're highly regulated, as they should be. Shifting operations is a multi-year effort, bringing with it regulatory requirements not seen in other industries. While the supply chains for other industries are important to the economy and to consumers, most don't have the same impact that we have on human lives. Secondly, ours is a mostly fixed reimbursement environment. Medical technologies are purchased by hospitals through multi-year contracts, making cost spikes difficult to adjust to, if at all. Our customers are Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA, federal programs. Any revenues that might be generated by tariffs could be offset by higher prices. Increasing costs to federal programs seems to me to be counterproductive. Currently, medtech represents only 5% of healthcare spending in the United States and historically has been deflationary. For example, a pacemaker adjusted for inflation now costs 20% less today than it did 10 years ago. And that's fairly typical for our products. Finally, the medical supply chain for medtech is highly complex. Many products contain several hundred parts from multiple countries and multiple regions around the world. Let me give you an example. Recently, a U.S. company purchased a foreign company with the intent of moving its operations to the United States. Why? Because this company manufactures two critical neonatal products that respectively supply 50% and 70% of American NICUs with this product. The plan to move that operation will take 3 to 5 years to fully implement. In the meantime, tariffs, if wrongly implemented, will threaten that plan. And as a result, could put NICUs in a very difficult position. That's not a risk, in our opinion, worth taking. Let me conclude by saying this. We appreciate the President's 90-day pause. We're encouraged by his most recent announcements on China as well. But we believe that for the medtech industry to continue delivering to patients requires maximum tariff flexibility. We're asking for medtech products to be treated with a reciprocal zero-for-zero model in each of the administration's country-by-country negotiations. Historically, this has been the place that medtech has landed. So, Mr. Chairman, we stand ready to work with you, with the President and this administration to move forward to support this industry and allow it to continue to be the growing and vibrant American presence that it has always been. With that, thank you for the time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. We'll next go with Dr. Baskaran.
Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Wyden, and distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to share my views with you today. My name is Dr. Gracelin Baskaran. I am the Director of the Critical Mineral Security Program at CSIS, and I have spent the last 12 years working extensively on critical minerals policy, both in the U.S. and abroad. It's no secret to anyone in this room that the U.S. faces a severe level of vulnerability in its access to minerals that underpin national, economic, and energy security. China stands as a lead producer for 30 of the 50 critical minerals that we have identified. However, importantly, China didn't achieve this position alone. It it drove this position and emerged as this key producer of these mineral supply chains by leveraging trade. Despite producing just 10% of the world's lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper, China imports minerals from across the world and now controls processing at the level of 65 to 90% of these key supply chains. This level of control is a direct product of targeted foreign policy to secure minerals, trade policy, and domestic industrial strategy to bring them back home. So the question is, what should the U.S. do? We are absolutely operating on the back foot today. While ramping up domestic production is of utmost importance, the uncomfortable truth is that we're not going to do this alone. And this is largely not just because of a political will problem, it's also because of geology. The United States holds less than 1% of the world's nickel, graphite, and cobalt, and we actually only have 1.3% of the world's rare earths. So reduced dependence, the U.S. has to lead a coalition utilizing trade agreements, coordinating investment, sharing resources, and driving partnerships and processing. This isn't a strategic option, it's now an imperative. The U.S. possesses an arsenal of tools, so here are 6 quick recommendations. The first is that the U.S. should take a more strategic and pragmatic approach to determining which countries are allies. One challenge of the Inflation Reduction Act Section 30D provision was the friendshoring component and determining who is an ally. Under the provisions, minerals had to be sourced from the U.S. or a country we had a free trade agreement with. While intended to boost production, the rigid requirement sidelined key allies and some of the world's most resource-rich countries like Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, Namibia, Vietnam, and Zambia. Despite China imposing rare earth restrictions, the reality is that Brazil and Vietnam have more rare earths together than all of China's reserves, yet neither countries were eligible for the 30D provision. Additionally, we'll need to be more strategic about sourcing partnerships with countries that have high mineral processing ambitions, because we're not going to become a processing leader immediately. Countries like Japan, Australia, Canada, Saudi Arabia will be critical. Second, we can look at tariffs. Ronald Reagan once said, if you want more of something, subsidize it, and if you want less of something, tax it. The reality is the United States needs more minerals urgently. There are 2 things we need to consider. First, tariffs undermine a nascent processing sector. Ultimately, we'll need to source feedstock from countries around the world to bring them back home, but processing often operates on razor-thin profit margins. By increasing the cost of raw ore 10 to 25%, we undermine the competitiveness of an early industry. The second thing we need to consider is trade diversion, even of processed minerals. For things like zinc, germanium, and gallium, we rely on Canada for those minerals. And by putting in tariffs, Tech CEO Jonathan Price has said they may be looking to shift from the U.S. to Asia. The next thing we need to look at is integrating U.S. offtake into U.S. financing. Where we're leveraging things like DFC and EXIM financing, we could take a page out of the Japanese playbook to ensure that a portion of offtake comes back to American auto manufacturers, semiconductor manufacturers, and other energy industries and defense. The next thing is prioritizing vertical integration. One of the big challenges is where we're financing early stage mining projects, it ultimately ends up back in Chinese hands. The most recent example is a rare earth project in Brazil that is backed by the US-led Mineral Security Partnership that's already announced offtake will go back to China. This is only strengthening China's dominance. Ensuring that we're considering vertical integration from the beginning is absolutely critical. And finally, we need to ensure that we are investing in infrastructure, in the ecosystem. It's not just about building a mine, it's about building energy, roads, and rail, and strategic partnerships like the Libido Corridor ensure that Western companies retain access to these minerals. Ultimately, it will be a whole of government approach, and it will require a full toolkit to build these partnerships with countries. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you for those recommendations. Mr. Issacs.
Thank you, Chairman Crapo and Senator Wyden and members of the committee. I'm David Issacs with the Semiconductor Industry Association. And as this committee well knows, semiconductors are a key enabler of the technologies of the future, driving our economy and national security from AI and advanced computing to medical technologies. And fortunately, semiconductor companies in the U.S. are the leaders in this industry. This hearing is timely because a strong supply chain is essential to our industry's ability to innovate and compete. The semiconductor supply chain is highly complex, consisting of thousands of specialized suppliers for research, design, manufacturing, and together this supply chain allows us to bring advanced technology to the market that pushes the boundaries of physics and deliver ever-increasing levels of performance. So a resilient supply chain is critical to our competitiveness and innovation. And our ability to leverage the global supply chain is itself a competitive advantage for the U.S. industry. One way we can make the supply chain more resilient is by revitalizing the chip ecosystem right here in the United States. And fortunately, we're making enormous strides in that through massive investments to achieve this goal. The industry has announced investments of over $540 billion in dozens of projects in 28 states around the country in the entire ecosystems, fabrication, advanced packaging, equipment, materials. And these facilities are making our country stronger and growing our economy and making our supply chain more resilient. To sustain these and continue these investments in the supply chain, it's critical that we have access to global markets. Over 70% of our sales are overseas, and we need that revenue to maintain market and technology leadership. Our industry is enormously research intensive and capital intensive. Approximately 20% of our revenue is plowed back into research, and CapEx costs are huge. A leading edge memory or logic fab can cost as much as $20 to $30 billion. And so having our ability to sell globally helps sustain these high levels of investment. So as we look at on the horizon, wrongly implemented tariffs can create risks for our ability to conduct business overseas. We share the goal of the Trump administration to rebalance trade relationships and build the supply chain here in the U.S. But we fear that broad-based tariffs could increase the cost of critical inputs in American manufacturing and therefore weaken the competitiveness of the U.S. industry. So to avoid this outcome, we call for a more targeted and strategic policy, and I'm happy to discuss that further. But we believe strongly that these targeted tariffs should be accompanied by a pro-growth, pro-innovation policy agenda to ensure that the U.S. is the best destination for research, design, and manufacturing. And we believe there are 5 primary components to such a strategy. First, as part of the tax bill, the highly successful advanced manufacturing investment credit should be extended in duration. It should be strengthened to an increase to 35%, and it should be expanded to include chip research and design. Second, we need to continue to invest and increase investments in research, which is the foundation of our innovation and also trains the next generation of scientists and engineers. Third, workforce development is key, and that means STEM education and training workers here in the United States, while at the same time enabling us to attract and retain high-skilled foreign nationals. Finally, fourth, we need smart regulation to ensure that these facilities get up and running as soon as possible. And finally, we need a trade policy that increases access to growing markets. And among other things in that regard, we believe a sectoral agreement can be used in semiconductors to grow markets, increase demand for chips that are designed and manufactured here in the U.S. We believe such a pro-investment, pro-innovation strategy will secure our supply chain, maintain our technology leadership, and grow the economy and keep America on top. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ragland.
Good morning, Chairman Crapo, Ranking Member Wyden, and distinguished members of the Senate Finance Committee. It is an honor to join you today to testify on behalf of the American Soybean Association regarding trade and critical supply chains. My name is Caleb Ragland. I'm a ninth-generation soybean farmer from Kentucky. I also serve as president of ASA, which represents U.S. soybean farmers across 30 soy-producing states. Soybeans are the largest agriculture export in the U.S., and robust international trade is a top priority of our farmers. Opening new markets is not simple. It requires time, attention, and long-term relationship maintenance to ensure that once open to exports, market access remains unhindered. China is the largest market for oilseeds, importing approximately 110 million metric tons, or 60% of global soybean trade. Its importance to U.S. soybean farmers cannot be overstated. Last marketing year, 54% of U.S. soybean exports went to China, accounting for 25 million metric tons in volume and $13 billion in value for U.S. farmers. By comparison, our next two largest markets, the EU and Mexico, imported 4.9 million metric tons of U.S. soybeans each. For soybean farmers, the impact of retaliatory tariffs on our exports are never out of mind. During the 2018 trade war, China applied regulatory duties against U.S. soybeans that reached up to 30.5%. These duties severely constrained our exports to China. According to estimates from USDA's Economic Research Service, U.S. soybean exports to China decreased in value by 76% from 2017 to 2018. ERS also estimated the trade war cost U.S. agriculture over $27 billion. Soybeans accounted for 71% of those losses. I want to emphasize, the U.S. soybean industry is still dealing with long-term negative impacts from the last trade war. Now our farmers are facing another trade war, one that could dwarf the pain felt in 2018. Since February, there have been multiple rounds of tariffs imposed on our global trading partners under IEEPA. A 20% duty was levied on Chinese goods into the U.S. in March, and China immediately responded with 10% retaliatory duty on U.S. soybeans. This situation continued to escalate until last week, when both countries announced an agreement to reduce tariffs and continue to negotiate. Today, the total duty on U.S. soybeans into China is 34%. This includes a retaliatory duty of 10%, the new baseline 10% rate, plus the most favored nation rate and China's value-added tax. While this reduction is a step in the right direction, U.S. soybeans are still facing a duty into our largest export market, nearly equal to the height of the 2018 trade war. If the retaliatory tariffs return or escalate after the pause, we can expect to see futures prices for U.S. soy decline significantly as early as this summer. At the same time, the two largest trading partners, EU and Canada, have threatened to retaliate against U.S. soy exports. Farmers depend on exports, but we are also reliant upon imports for critical farm inputs. The current tariff situation is complicating this matter. For example, the U.S. relies on Canada for 87% of our potash supply. Seeds and agriculture equipment are subject to U.S. import duties. I must emphasize to you, our farm economy is in a dire situation. Commodity prices are down nearly 50% from 3 years ago, while farmers are still facing elevated prices for land, seeds, fertilizer, and pesticides. As the administration negotiates with trading partners to reduce barriers and address reciprocal trade issues, we encourage this committee to press the White House on the importance of market access for U.S. agriculture. My written testimony includes specific asks of our industry, including a strong plea to couple this reciprocal tariff strategy with swift negotiations to reduce tariffs and remove market barriers for U.S. ag products. Tit-for-tat trade wars are not beneficial, and U.S. agriculture cannot afford them. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify on behalf of U.S. soy farmers regarding the importance of global trade and the impact of tariffs on our industry. ASA appreciates the work ahead of this committee, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share the perspective of U.S. soybean farmers with you. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ragland, and I thank, again, all of our witnesses for providing your insights to us. You'll get an opportunity to engage with members of the Senate as they talk with you, but we may want to communicate with you as we move forward in developing the necessary policies that we should pursue. Mr. Issacs, I'd like to talk with you first. You mentioned in your statement a tax item that we should consider. As you know, we are working on that right now. You were referring to the advanced manufacturing tax credit, and I think you referenced that it should be extended, but also expanded to include chips. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. Well, it's vitally important to continue to rebuild our manufacturing capabilities here in the United States, and we're seeing the results from the current tax credit in achieving those goals. It's also important that we maintain our technology leadership, and the U.S. is the traditional leader in chip design, and yet other countries are directing incentives to displace U.S. leadership. And right now, the U.S. is the only leading nation that lacks a direct incentive for chip design. And so we believe that the tax credit could help attract investment and spur employment to make sure that this high-value design activity is conducted here in the U.S., and we maintain that first mover advantage.
And are chips already included in the current provision, or do they need to be added?
It would need to be added, sir.
All right, thank you very much. And Ms. Baskaran, you referenced in your testimony the IRA and difficulties in the way that the IRA is administered with regard to certain products. Could you explain that a little better to me?
Of course, thank you so much. So the 30D provision, which gives us a tax credit for $7,500, is split by minerals that are processed in the United States or a country that we have a free trade agreement with. And every year, the threshold of minerals that has to be sourced to meet that requirement grows from 50% to 60% to 70%. The difficulty is that geology didn't fall along historical trade agreements. So many of the minerals that we need are outside of countries that we have a free trade agreement with. For example, when we look at a continent like Africa, which has upwards of 50% of the world's cobalt, palladium, platinum, chromium, significant reserves of lithium, there's only one country in Africa that we have a free trade agreement with. It's Morocco. And so what ends up happening is any incentive is a disincentive. So that means that countries that don't have a free trade agreement with are inherently less competitive. So we're less likely to spur investment in non-FTA countries. The problem with that, of course, is that China has made significant progress in emerging markets in sourcing long-term mineral offtake agreements that are now feeding into Chinese processing. So if we want to create a more competitive regime, we need to extend that incentive or extend a new incentive into non-FTA countries that have minerals.
All right, thank you very much. We may want to get back with you on details as to how exactly to accomplish that in terms of revising that, but I appreciate your highlighting that for us. And Mr. Whitaker, the American medtech industry is a major driver of innovation, economic growth, and job creation. However, this is a highly regulated industry. It's not easy to quickly move manufacturing here, as you indicated in your testimony. Moreover, some of the manufacturing entails low-value products that don't generate significant returns. How can we help identify what parts of the supply chain are essential to nearshore and the other parts that may benefit from tariff relief through trade agreements?
Yeah, so great question. We source things from all over the country and all over the world as well. So from plastics to rubbers to tungsten, the kind of list goes on and on. So having open access to those markets without large tariffs assigned to those makes it easiest for us to import those back into this country and then finish those products and sell them to hospitals in the United States. So the tariff barrier, the current tariff barrier, is the biggest challenge we've faced in a long time relative to accessing all the component parts we need to finish these products and provide them to hospitals.
All right, thank you. And I'd like to just go back to you, Mr. Issacs, very quickly for the last 30 seconds that I have. You indicated that you had some ideas on how the tariff policy could be better targeted in your world. Could you just give us 30 seconds on that?
Yes, thank you, Senator. So we believe that any tariffs should be targeted to either specific product categories or countries of concern. We certainly think there should be appropriate exemptions for critical inputs so they don't inadvertently raise our costs. There should be phased-in processes to allow the supply chain to adjust over time, things like that.
Thank you very much. Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. It's been a very good panel. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Ragland, and very much appreciate your thoughtful work in the soybean area. You've given us a lot of good information, and your organization's been very helpful. This morning, it was released by some researchers that since the inauguration on January 20th, Trump administration officials have announced new or revised tariff policies more than 50 times. And one research analysis said it was 50 times, one said it was 55, but the fact is it's been something that has been again and again and again. What does that mean for agriculture and soybeans, Mr. Ragland? It seems to me, because I met with wheat farmers in Eastern Oregon just a little bit ago, they said more than anything we want some predictability and some certainty. Give us that. Whatever else you guys do in D.C., and who knows what goes on back there, give us some predictability and certainty. What happens when you change your mind 50 times?
Well, it gives our customers uncertainty in their minds and gives them the reason to look for other sources that are more dependable. When we have established these long-term relationships, I mean, with China, for example, we've been working there since 1982 to establish that relationship. And then with the stroke of a pen, we can damage that severely. Before the first trade war, 1 in 3 rows of soybeans from the U.S. went to China. Last year, it was 1 row out of 4. And it can go down significantly quickly and hurt the economic opportunities for our farmers. We are struggling already, and a trade war adds severe pain to the farmers, not just soybeans, but exports are over half of our total production. We must have them. We don't need to give our customers an excuse to go to Brazil. And Brazil has overtaken us as the leader in soybean production.
I hope my colleagues heard that these incredibly flawed trade policies are driving customers that would look at the United States to Brazil. Please just continue.
One other thing I would add, approximately 90 million acres are grown of soybeans year in, year out in the U.S. Brazil right now has the potential to add up to 270 million more acres that is in pasture right now. There is nearly unlimited opportunity. If we give excuses for our customers to look elsewhere, they will, and they have. We have a precedent. And furthermore, China has invested significantly in infrastructure in Brazil to help them get their product to market. Right now, we have better infrastructure, but they're gaining on us. And this is very concerning for a soybean farmer and our future.
Thank you, and we appreciate your leadership. Let me go to you, Ms. Baskaran. The Republicans in the House voted this morning to repeal the single best tool in the toolbox to incentivize growth in minerals and energy supply chains, the IRA tax credits. We wrote them in this room. And my thought from the very beginning, the technological neutrality feature and the fact that there were no mandates would be a huge success. I continue to believe that it is still in the markets, but there is no question that the Republicans in the House are acting to remove those IRA tax credits. The Trump chaotic tariffs added to the tax credits looks to me like a double whammy against the ability to have these promising new industries and resourcing in America. What do you think about that? And what's your counsel, particularly given the fact we've got changes 50 times when you need some predictability?
Thank you, Senator. One of the most important things, we sometimes think about building mineral supply alone. We're going to make more, but the minerals have to go somewhere. We need a demand signal, and the Inflation Reduction Act was an important demand signal.
Don't put it in the past tense. We aren't giving
It is a very important demand signal.
Thank you.
But I want to go one step past that, because, you know, one of the dilemmas with the Chips and Science Act, the $280 billion that was allocated, is there was actually no mineral sourcing provision for the Chips and Science Act, which meant that there was no money allocated to sourcing minerals. So we remain today reliant on China and Russia for commodities like germanium, gallium, polysilicon, and these are really critical minerals because there's no incentive. So the Inflation Reduction Act is critical. It stimulated mineral demand. At the end of the day, the defense industry is a critical off-taker of minerals, but it's small. We might build 100 satellites, we don't build 10,000. So for mining companies to have the incentive to invest in those large scales, electric vehicles, automotives are going to be absolutely critical. But we should also think about expanding and thinking, how do we ensure that we have mineral incentives to source for the defense industry, for the semiconductor industry? So there's a lot we can take from the IRA being critical and expanding it to ensure that we're sourcing mineral incentives across industries.
Thank you. And just one quick question, if I can get it in. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Donald Trump, with respect to the CHIPS Act, said, quote, "It's horrible, horrible thing." And a lot of members on this committee were involved in putting this together. He wants to repeal it. Question to you, Mr. Issacs, wouldn't you like to build on the CHIPS Act rather than tear it apart?
Thank you, Senator. Absolutely, it should be built upon. You know, the CHIPS Act got initiated during the first Trump administration, and it was authorized in the defense bill during his first term. And I think it's wholly consistent with the Trump administration policies about revitalizing American manufacturing and growing American technology leadership. And I think it's proven to be highly successful to date throughout the supply chain in attracting investment. The numbers speak for themselves, and we need to maintain that momentum through the tax policy that I referenced earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Gracelin.
Yeah. Mr. Ragland, you're the only one I missed your testimony on. I apologize, but I was called out to be on Omaha radio, and we were talking trade, and I said at least you were here to represent the Soybean Association of the Midwest and the national people. So I hope I'm not repetitive when I ask you questions that our ranking member brought up. But in your testimony, you talked about the importance of the Chinese market for soybeans. You mentioned that 54% of all soybeans exported last year went to China. You also mentioned the possibility of a Phase 2 agreement between the United States and China. One of the key pieces of Phase 1 was a purchasing agreement that China failed to comply with in previous years. Are the old purchasing agreements under Phase 1 sufficient for soybean industry today?
Thank you for the question, Senator Grassley. We need increased trade is the bottom line. That is the lifeblood of American agriculture and the American soybean industry in particular, the largest ag export in the U.S. The Phase 1 deal with China had wonderful opportunities if compliance and enforcement had taken place, but it didn't. But we would like to see a minimum of those volumes return, and we need those desperately. As I stated in my testimony, we have not returned to the pre-2018 trade war levels, where over a third of U.S. soybeans were exported to China. The highest we've got back to was about 25%. So we have a lot of room to make up, and the main thing is just getting those volumes back because it has been devastating. Our prices are similar to what they were pre-trade war in 2018, but our costs of production are so much higher as inflation has been very difficult on agriculture in general. And we need higher prices, and that's driven by higher demand, and trade drives demand, and that's what we need because China is such a large customer. They have all of the poultry and all of the pork. There's more pigs in China than the rest of the world combined. Their appetite for the soy protein is nearly unlimited, and that's why they are so vital. We can't just replace them with other customers.
I stressed to Ambassador Greer earlier this year, while it is important to hold China accountable to their international commitments, the United States must find alternative markets for both imports and exports. Over dependence on any one market leads to less resilient supply chains. We tend to stress the importance of China, Japan, South Korea, United Kingdom, India, few others for trade, but there's 190 other countries that represent market opportunities. What countries besides China should the United States look to as the alternative market for soybeans and our soy byproducts?
Senator, we're certainly looking around the world. India is complicated, but their large population makes them a target we want to look to, but there's some other barriers there outside of tariffs to do with their business model and their production model within the country. But we are working, our MAP and FMD funds are very helpful as we develop markets around the world. We have asked for increased funding as part of our policy to double those funds because they are quickly used up and there is much more demand than there is supply, and that helps us to diversify markets, grow markets, and we are working. We certainly want to expand and diversify so we're not dependent on China, but as I stated earlier, just the sheer volume, they import more soybeans than the rest of the world combined. It's hard, we can't completely replace them. They're still going to be a major player, but we certainly want to work around the world to grow markets.
Because you just answered my last question, because I was going to ask you about the importance of market access. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Catwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses. Today's hearing has already been sobering and also illuminating about what a better path forward is. Sobering because you're talking about the costs that we still are being impacted by. And I think the first thing to remember is that we're still at a 30% tariff right now on many products, and so that is costing us. I think with all the happy talk about, well, we decided to pull the gun from, you know, the business head related to the 125% plus tariffs, the fact remains we still have a 30% tariff on products from China. In fact, it's higher than that, 50 or 60% on steel and aluminum. So the point is, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which caused a recession, were only 20%. So here we are, still in a world of uncertainty with a 30% tariff. Now, Mr. Ragland, do you know where Kalama, Washington is?
It's in the state of Washington,
Yes.
but I don't know specifically.
It just happens to be the second largest port for export of soybeans in the United States of America. So I pay attention to soybeans, I sure do. And the fact that the last Trump administration trade war, you were at 62% market share in China, competing with Brazil, and he plummeted you down to 18%, and then somehow you were going to get the Chinese to cooperate or do something, which they didn't, and guess what? You never recovered, 52%. You never got back to the 62% high, because the trade war, as you said in your testimony, created havoc and uncertainty, and all that hard work of all you people going over and getting markets open, you never recovered. So why are we going to continue this trade war when we know what the results were last time? So now, what I'm hearing, and you're verifying in your testimony, Mr. Issacs, is that semiconductor costs are up. That's the input to building and manufacturing semiconductors. We worked hard, Senator Cornyn and I and many other people, to get that bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, done. We sure as heck, we also gave them a NEPA exemption. So we don't want semiconductor inputs to be more expensive. We don't want motor vehicle parts, which are now 9.3% more expensive, and computer and electronics. So you all talked about supply chain chaos today, and that's the point. I don't think somebody told the president our supply chain, even post his last administration, is so much more integrated today than it was before. And when you cause supply chain chaos, as you were saying, Mr. Isaacson, then it leaves us behind in the foot race when we should be opening up market share. So how many trade agreements has the world done in the last, since 2017? How many have our partners around the globe done? 90. 90 trade agreements. 90. How many did we do? One. We updated the USMCA. So I represent a very trade-dependent part of the United States of America. I support more trade. I support getting trade deals done. I don't support the disruption and chaos that this is causing. So, Mr. Issacs, I have a question for you. You basically, well, first of all, Mr. Ragland, if we proceed with where we are, we don't get these tariffs off, will we lose farmers in America? Will we lose actual farmers in America?
Yes, that is a very harsh reality. The farm economy is struggling. I mean, I'm a younger farmer. I know farmers that have went out of business. There's bankruptcies taking place. I know older farmers who are choosing to leave the industry because of the limited economic opportunity. They don't want to lose what they've worked their whole lives for.
And so, Mr. Isaacson, you're saying that we should be going in the opposite direction, that we should be building alliances around semiconductor supply chains and development, and that would enhance the United States, because right now you're saying that serious harm is being caused to the semiconductor industry because of these tariffs.
Well, I think the first option is to build it here and strengthen the U.S. supply chain. But the fact of the matter is that it's a global supply chain, and that's a part of our strength as an industry, and therefore we should make sure we have secure access to key inputs from a diversity of trading partners around the world, and that is essential to our ability to innovate and compete globally.
And you're saying in your testimony we could even do this better with a bigger sectoral approach.
That's correct. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cornyn.
In fairness, I know that our Democratic colleagues have been very critical of the Trump administration, but I don't remember a single free trade agreement negotiated during President Biden's term of office. As a matter of fact, our Democratic colleagues in the former administration were allergic to free trade negotiations. It was President Trump who negotiated the USMCA, and at least he's been trying to level the playing field for American companies, goods and services around the world. So it's easy to criticize, but the truth is President Trump is trying to do what the previous administration failed to do, which is to level the playing field. So, Dr. Baskaran, as Mr. Issacs knows, we focused a lot in the last few years on the advanced semiconductor supply chain. If there's one thing that COVID exposed, it's our dependency on these vulnerable supply chains. But now that we've begun to address the supply chains of advanced semiconductors, thanks, as you pointed out, Mr. Issacs, to the first Trump administration, when I remember distinctly Mike Pompeo and Wilbur Ross bringing to us this vulnerability and saying, you know, we only make 12% of these in the United States, and this is a terrible national security and economic risk. So we've begun to remedy that. But Dr. Baskaran, you've talked a little bit about the mining and the resources of these critical minerals, but would you distinguish between processing and mining? In other words, my understanding is that while you're exactly right that we do need additional reserves of these critical minerals, China still controls 90% of the processing, and so this is an incredible vulnerability for the United States. Do you agree?
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Absolutely. It is our single biggest vulnerability is the processing.
And this isn't just an economic vulnerability. This is a national security vulnerability, right?
Absolutely. We saw it just this last couple of weeks with the heavy rare earth export restrictions. We produce heavy rare earths here in the United States. We can get heavy rare earths from Brazil, but we're currently stockpiling them because typically we send our heavy rare earths to China for separation because our separation facilities aren't completed. Now we're unable to do that because we don't have those processing capabilities finished. So we need to build those capabilities here at home. But one of the key binding constraints that we have here in the U.S. for that is it's extremely energy intensive. And we don't actually have the energy at scale to be able to cost competitively do that. So while we want to build our processing capabilities, given the low profit margins on that segment of the supply chain, we need to ensure that we're working on the other infrastructure barriers around that here at home. Ultimately, if we are to take a page out of China's playbook, We're going to source minerals from abroad, and we're going to do the best we can to bring them back home for processing or to allied countries.
Well, I know that President Trump has been not only negotiated a critical minerals deal with Ukraine, which I think will address a lot of the concerns we have about access to reserves, but also reports are that he's negotiating with the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I was in the DRC in last August and learned, as you point out, about the Lobito corridor, which is the only opportunity we have to eliminate China's monopoly on these critical minerals that are being produced in the DRC. And so it seems to me that some good work is being done in Ukraine and in Africa in providing greater access to the reserves. And I take your point that we need to broaden our access to other friends and allies around the world who maybe we don't have free trade agreements with. But if we don't do more on processing, we're still going to see China with a stranglehold on the United States economically and national security-wise. I had a chance to visit a rare earth processing facility in Fort Worth recently, MP Materials, where they are the sole manufacturer and processor of rare earth minerals to make magnets. And for those who are uninitiated, like I was, magnets are needed in everything with an electric motor, from national security material to the cars we drive and everything else. And that's a single facility in the United States. And so we need a lot more processing in addition to more reserves, because if you set aside semiconductors for a second, to me, this is the single biggest vulnerability, I agree with you, that the United States economy and our national security has. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Wyden, for having this hearing. Welcome, and thank you to our witnesses today. Dr. Baskaran, I want to start with a question for you. Critical minerals like gallium and germanium are used in a wide range of essential products, from phones to medical devices to defense technology. Your organization recently issued a report detailing Canada's abundance of critical minerals and the ways in which enhanced U.S. cooperation with Canada could solve some of our country's supply chain problems. However, instead of working with Canada on critical minerals trade, the President has targeted Canadian imports with truly reckless tariffs, while making concessions to the Chinese government to try to access their mineral reserves. Considering our long and close relationship with Canada, do you think the administration should prioritize critical mineral trade with Canada to strengthen our supply chains?
Thank you, Senator. Canada is going to be one of our strongest allies if we are to reduce reliance on China. And it goes back to Senator Cornyn's point on mineral processing. At the end of the day, we take our zinc here in the United States, we send it to Canada, they refine it, we get our germanium out of it, and we bring it back to manufacture here in the United States. It's such a vertically integrated. It goes to uranium. We want to be a global energy leader. We want to build our nuclear energy. It's a bipartisan goal. Canada's uranium reserves are 10 times bigger than ours. They don't enrich it. They don't process it. We're building processing capabilities. We want to bring it back home. So what we see is that given the mining, refining, and manufacturing, they're so vertically integrated, we will not be able to do it without strengthening our relationship with Canada.
I appreciate that very much. And as somebody who lives close to the Canadian border, I'm really going to continue to encourage us to do that. Mr. Issacs, the United States leads the world in advanced AI-capable semiconductor design and development. One way that the U.S. leverages our global AI leadership is through export controls that stop chips from being sold to China, whether by American companies or by our allies. These export controls require cooperation with our close allies like Japan and the Netherlands and help American companies stay on the leading edge. Mr. Issacs, can you speak more about the importance of coordination with our allies on the semiconductor trade and how trade policies that attack our allies could give China the advantage in developing advanced AI?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Obviously, coordination with our allies on export controls is essential. It serves at least two purposes. One is to ensure that the technology we're seeking to restrict is not falling in the hands of adversaries. And number two, it ensures that U.S. companies are not prohibited from making sales while their global competitors are. So, I think to serve those twin purposes, we need to coordinate with our allies on export controls that address our national security concerns while making sure that the U.S. remains the leader in AI technology and has that our technology is deployed around the world so we retain our market leadership and our technology leadership.
Thank you. Another question for you, Mr. Issacs. Building up our domestic defense technology industrial base and onshoring critical supply chains is obviously crucial to our national security. One of the ways we can do this is to strengthen our relationships with our international allies so that American defense technology companies can gain market share and grow, which obviously creates jobs here at home. However, the President has imposed reckless and constantly changing tariffs on our allies. Who are customers? Who are allies who are customers for American defense technology companies? Does antagonizing our allies improve our national security, or does it weaken the ability of the American defense technology base to grow jobs at home by exporting their products?
Well, Senator, I think the challenges facing the chip companies that focus on defense technologies are very similar to the challenges facing commercial companies as well. Yeah. They deploy the same supply chain and utilize many of the same processes. And as I mentioned in my testimony, global sales are the lifeblood of our industry. Over 70% of our sales are overseas, and that capacity provides us with scale that allows us to invest and innovate and retain market leadership, and that's a virtuous cycle that continues. So we need to maintain market access as a means of propelling our leadership.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. Mr. Whitaker, I want to start with you. I know about, I think you mentioned in your opening statement about medical devices being the backbone of our healthcare system. I think about 2/3 of it is manufactured here in the U.S., but we really saw an exposure during COVID in terms of PPEs and a disproportionately high reliance on China. Can you give me some thoughts on the thing that's maddening? This reminds me of almost like storms. After we have a storm, we talk about resiliency and building back stronger, all those sorts of things. And as time goes on, we forget about it. I feel like we're at risk of forgetting the lesson we learned during the COVID crisis. So can you give me some idea of what we could do to eliminate the vulnerabilities and exposures going forward, or what Congress should do to play a role in that?
Yeah, first of all, I'd say I think we've made a lot of progress since COVID, at least in our industry, and I can speak only for our industry, to relocate a lot of facilities and a lot of products closer to the U.S. Not everything back in the U.S. because we can't fully get there, but we've relocated a lot of products and technologies, PPE, and even more specific technologies in Mexico. Talk a little bit about,
because I agree with you about the complete, lift and set back in the U.S. probably doesn't make sense for a variety of reasons. Yeah. Talk very briefly, if you could, about why bringing it all back doesn't necessarily make sense for the long term.
Yeah, it's complicated, but there's a reason why we have the USMCA agreement. So the goal is to try to relocate as much of it as we can within North America so we can then get those supplies into the U.S. You have critical manufacturing facilities that are already set up and operational and manufacturing certain types of technologies. Rather than build a new facility in the U.S., which will cost a lot of money and take 3 to 5 years to get up and operational to get FDA approval for, it's much easier and lower cost to build it very close to the border and then have the ability to ship that in. And that's why the system works as it does so well for us.
I agree. Mr. Issacs, can you talk a little bit about how tariffs could affect supply chain specifically in the semiconductor space, and what advice would you give us as we proceed, as the administration proceeds with an initiative that I fundamentally agree with, but I also want to make sure that we're not exposing some of the critical supply chains like semiconductors. Give me some of your advice on how we should proceed.
Thank you, Senator. So as I referenced before, we believe a sectoral trade agreement with like-minded nations would advance our interests in many ways. I think it could accelerate and increase demand for U.S. designed and manufactured chips. It would allow us to align standards on technology and things like IP protection with our trading partners. It would allow us to sell more into global markets in areas like government procurement and critical infrastructure. And we believe that sort of positive trade agenda would be advantageous for our industry and our economic and national security.
Mr. Ragland, I've got about 40 farmers in my office. The North Carolina Farm Bureau is I'm about to meet with, and we grow soybeans. We grow 80 different commodities at scale. It's about a $100 billion sector in North Carolina, so we punch pretty well above our weight if you look at our geographic footprint. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about how trade right now. I had some farmers in my office a couple of weeks ago, and they're supportive of what President Trump is doing. They say we just need to be patient. And I asked them, what does that mean? 3 years? They said no. 2 years? No. 1 year? No. I said, so you really need some certainty going into this season, or there are going to be farmers on the margins that could be in real trouble. We always are. We got a Congress that hasn't passed the Farm Bill. We've got weather outbreak. We got a lot of things that are being lopped on these farmers that, in my opinion, have the toughest job out there. You got all the complexity of running a business, plus all the unknowns of Mother Nature. So what I did watch your opening statement from my office, but what would you like to say in terms of, if I could only fix one or two things right now? The trade uncertainty is just going to have to work itself out, but I see labor and other things as major impediments to making your day a good day. Just very, very quickly, so I'm running out of time. Tell me, outside of trade, what should we really be focusing on to give you some headroom while we try to sort out all these trade agreements?
Thanks for the question, Senator Tillis. A lot to unpack here. Real quick, I would say more than anything, we need a level playing field. And that doesn't deal with trade some. But obviously, overregulation with the pesticide seeds, so there's so much going on there that could be streamlined so we have the best technologies.
Adverse wage rates.
Yeah, adverse wage rates, the issues with getting labor in through the H-2A program, tax law. There's a litany of opportunities.
So that's, I think, when we talk about the pressure on farm, it's fine to say that we should definitely get this tightened up fairly quickly. I hope the administration does, but let's not lose sight of all the other things that we should be doing independent of that will make your job a lot easier. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this hearing as well. I appreciate all of the panelists today and the conversation. Dr. Pronounce your name for me. Is it Baskaran? Baskaran?
Baskaran.
Baskaran. Thank you very much. Let me ask you this, and I'm sure you've talked a little bit about this, and I understand Senator Cornyn addressed this a little with you with rare earth minerals. But we know China controls 90% of the world's manufacturing of rare earth minerals into magnets, which we know are critical to U.S. national defense and the economy. I have a bipartisan bill that would help build the U.S. supply chain for these minerals by creating a tax credit for companies domestically manufacturing the magnets necessary to power American technology. My question to you is, do you think there is a role for tax credits like these to incentivize greater production of mined and processed critical minerals in the United States?
Yes, I'll go first.
Production tax credits will be very important, Senator. The reason is this, is China actually flooded the market with rare earths between 2010 and about 2018, and it actually forced prices for rare earths down to a point that made it very difficult for non-Chinese entities to compete in this space. Remember, America was once the top rare earths producer in the world between the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So what we need is an incentive to get companies to make these long-term investments in a time when prices are really low. The difficulty is we are being outcompeted by the Chinese. So any way that we can reduce the cost of doing business for these companies is really going to be critical to what Mr. Ragland said is leveling the playing field.
Right.
We have the same dilemma in mining.
Do you think there are trade policies that complement domestic production tax credits? Is there something else we should be thinking about with respect to trade policies?
I think using some sort of trade incentive to source minerals from abroad, and this includes rare earths. Remember that in the United States, we are building our processing capabilities and our permanent magnet manufacturing. The difficulty is at the end of the day, we still have 1.3% of the world's reserves. We should be tapping into reserves. When we add up Brazil and Vietnam, it's actually greater than China in absolute reserves, but we're not really leveraging these to bring those rare earths back home to separate and manufacture here. That's what U.S. leadership is to me. It's sourcing from abroad to bring that home. So how do we create the tax incentive, the investment incentive in those markets to bring it home is going to be really key.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much. Let me also ask you, in Nevada, listen, I'm very proud. Nevada has the most mineral wealth of any state in the country, and we produced almost $10 billion worth of mineral commodities in 2024, which, by the way, supports about 83,000 jobs in my state. But as we were talking, this is threatened by Chinese, right? By Chinese firms that don't play by the rules, by overproducing, underpricing critical minerals to undercut our companies. Let me ask you this. Do you believe that targeted and strategic tariffs, unlike the chaotic blanket tariffs that we see here imposed by this administration, can play an important role? And as we are thinking about the targeted tariffs, please talk about if that works. Has it worked in the past, and what we should be thinking about in the future if we're looking at targeted tariffs?
Targeted tariffs are going to be really important. So, for example, we shouldn't be tariffing raw ore, right? Where we want to bring raw ore back home to the U.S. to process, putting a tariff on it makes it uncompetitive. I'll use copper as an example. 95% of the value of copper is generated when I take it out of the ground. The profit margins on refining are so small that if I make that ore 25% more expensive, it is unviable. There is not a company that will build a copper smelter here in the United States. So thinking more strategically to ensure that, A, we are not putting tariffs on raw ore will be super important. Second, are we using tariff policy in a way that is not punitive to countries that we want to source from, that may be new markets for minerals where we want our Western companies to go into? We don't want to put tariffs on those. Now, whether we use tariffs on finished products from China is a totally different question. It goes back to the Ronald Reagan quote, right? If we want more of something, subsidize it. If we want less of it, tariff. If we want less finished products from China, we should shift our tariff policy that way. But in agreement that putting tariffs across the board actually disincentivizes the development of a domestic refining industry.
So let me add to this, because I agree with you there. And I've been a proponent of AGOA, which is the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And it's a key element of our relationship with sub-Saharan Africa. But it creates valuable opportunities for U.S. workers, for businesses and consumers. And it's set to expire in September. AGOA Renewable provides a key strategic opportunity to diversify global supply chains and, again, reduce our reliance on China. Do you believe that AGOA Renewable provides an opportunity to advance U.S. critical mineral interests? And if you do, what should we be thinking about in Congress as we look to renew it? And I hope we do.
AGOA is one of the most bipartisan pieces of legislation, and it has been our absolute linchpin of commercial diplomacy with the African continent. Not renewing it would be a very negative signal to a continent that benefits enormously from it. Now, is AGOA in and of itself going to solve our critical minerals in its current form? Probably not. And part of that is because tariffs on minerals are generally very low. When I look at tariff rates with some African countries on minerals, they're like 2.5%. They're not going to be significantly more competitive because of AGOA AGOA. What would make AGOA more beneficial is potentially linking an investment incentive to it. It's kind of what the 30D did under IRA, right? I created an incentive to source minerals from these countries. Pairing AGOA with an investment incentive is not only a strong commercial diplomacy signal, it's a strong minerals diplomacy signal. So I like to think a little bit about AGOA 2.0 in that way, to think about how do we make minerals feature more prominently to make sure it's bilaterally beneficial.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank my colleague. Senator Whitehouse is next.
Thank you very much, Senator Wyden. I appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. Couple of observations. One is an observation by a quite renowned economist that the chaos and confusion about tariffs is itself a form of tariff. It's just a particularly stupid one because it provides no revenue. But I am absolutely seeing in Rhode Island businesses hesitancy about knowing whether to invest and whether to reroute supply chains because they don't know. We have a lot of business with Canada. It's our #1 trading partner. If you don't know what the tariff is going to be 6 months from now, it's hard to make a business decision. 90 days of clarity with China really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to somebody who has to make business decisions that might be planning years ahead. So I think it's really important that we settle down, stop thrashing about chaotically, decide what our tariff policy is going to be, and proceed in a scalpel smart way. One of the areas where I think we need to make a lot of progress has to do with a polluter advantage against American businesses. And I want to commend Senator Cassidy and Senator Graham for their attention to this problem. If you simplify and say that there's a cement factory on the Mexican border in the U.S. and a cement factory on the U.S. border in Mexico, and they're each 10 minutes away from the border, and one of them has to abide by significant pollution regulations that get built into the cost of the product, and the other does not, that a tariff is an extremely appropriate way of remedying that discrepancy. Another area that I would love to see a sharper focus for tariffs is that we have known for a long, long time that China, using a whole variety of sources, including the Chinese military, has had a very aggressive cyber campaign to hack into American businesses and raid them for intellectual property, whether it's designs, processes, formulae. We were on the losing end of what the former cyber commander described as the largest theft in human history. And we frankly didn't do much about it. After a lot of pressure and kicking and convincing, the Obama administration, I believe, finally indicted a number of Chinese military officers for participating in all this, but it kind of ended there. That was sent as a signal. It'd be interesting to me to track where we can show Chinese products are manufactured using stolen American intellectual property and tariff those companies and those products, and maybe even return the revenues to the companies whose intellectual property they stole. My point here is that tariffs have an important and vital function at policing fair international trade. But the lashing about and thrashing about, largely, it seems to me, just to get attention and cause other people to have to run around jumping through hoops for you, is not a smart way to go about it. And my worry is that we're going to spend months and months and months and months with economic drag on our economy because of this opening bid of rash, thoughtless tariff threats, and it's going to take a while for all that tumult to subside. So I'm glad we're holding this hearing, and I just want to be clear that at least this Democrat believes that there are really useful ways in which tariffs can be brought to bear to assure a world economy in which America is not the patsy, but that Rhode Island businesses, at least, are dealing with very high anxiety right now because of the uncertainty that's been created. Again, the dumbest form of tariff there is because it creates no revenue. Thank you.
Well said for both of my colleagues, and thank you. Senator Lujan's next.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. Mr. Issacs, as you may know, New Mexico is home to two national laboratories, Los Alamos and Sandia, and they've been at the forefront of some of our nation's most consequential scientific breakthroughs. Today, both labs are leaning into emerging technologies like AI, quantum computing, while helping the United States maintain a strategic advantage. As you know, the pace of AI innovation is accelerating rapidly. While domestic semiconductor production is ramping up, we simply cannot afford to wait for a new chip fab to fully be operational in some of these areas. Continued access to high-performance hardware is essential, not just for research, but for mission-critical national security applications. Mr. Issacs, yes or no, will President Trump's tariffs impact the importation of hardware needed to continue AI development and deployment?
I think it's too early to say, but it has the potential to increase costs for key inputs that are used in the process of making the chips that go into the AI stack. We estimate that about first of all, the vast majority of the cost of a fab is the very sophisticated engineered equipment, and approximately 80% of that is imported.
So I'll ask the question again. Will these tariffs make it harder to get the hardware needed? I think I heard you just say that.
They have the potential to raise those costs. 80% you just talked about,
that's the hardware.
You know, the landscape's not yet settled. We don't know what countries...
I'm sorry to interrupt there, but can you repeat what you said about the 80% of the hardware getting harder to import? Or can you talk about that? Yeah,
approximately 80% of the cost of a fab is the very sophisticated equipment that runs the fab.
And that's imported?
And about 2/3 of that, I believe, is imported. And so doing the math, depending on the tariff rate, there could be very substantial cost increases associated with that.
So do you think the president should exempt this hardware for national security missions?
Yes, we certainly think that there should be strategic targeted exemptions. We provided a list of key inputs in our comments to the Department of Commerce recently under their 232 investigation, a non-exhaustive list of key inputs, and we certainly think those should be considered for exemptions.
I appreciate that, and I agree with that. Mr. Whitaker, Americans, as you know, are terrified that tariffs on medical supplies will increase their health care costs, including already sky-high prescription drug prices as well. One New Mexican recently wrote me that the pharmaceutical tariffs will harm and kill me slowly. I need thyroid meds every single day to stop damage to my heart and kidneys. My kidneys are failing already. Please fight for me. Despite a Section 232 investigation still being underway, the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary Lutnick, has publicly stated that tariffs on pharmaceuticals are coming in the next month or two. President Trump recently said that due to his tariffs, American children don't need to have more dolls and they don't need to have more pencils. Now, my question to you is, are pharmaceuticals and medical devices different than dolls or pencils?
So they're obviously different. I don't represent the pharmaceutical industry, so I can't speak to that. I can speak to the medical technology industry, and the disruption that's been caused as a result of these tariffs is a challenge. And we don't have the same flexibility that many people do in the economy just to adjust and change our prices without impacting the healthcare system in a negative way. So clarity here and an exemption for medical technology products in the short term, I think, is critical to making sure there's patient access and making sure costs remain stable in the healthcare system.
I appreciate it. So from the perspective of having the medical equipment that is needed to treat a patient, can an American make do with a small percentage of the healthcare the doctor tells them they need or the equipment they need to keep them safe?
We do a nice job in this industry of providing American hospitals with American-made technology, but not all of it. So about 70% of our product made in America is supplied to American hospitals. So in the short term, we can continue to manage that. In the longer term, it will create a crisis.
I appreciate that. Look, I'm all about onshoring and nearshoring.
Yep.
I hope the United States steps forward in that way. Targeted tariffs might help.
Yes.
Across-the-board tariffs, I've heard from opening statements or responses to your questions, they didn't work this time. They haven't worked the last few times they've been used in America's history. I mean, we just go back and look at their impact. Let's look at the last one around the Great Depression and what effect that had on the economy. Mr. Ragland, farmers and ranchers have been reaching out to me quite a bit, looking at some of these inputs. This is a foundation not for just New Mexico, but all across America. Can you speak to the impact that this trade war is having not only on the farmers who your organization represents, but the rural communities they call home?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Before the trade war, agriculture in general is in a difficult spot due to inflated cost of production. And the last 3 years, our revenue that we're receiving for our crops is down about 50%. Prices are lower, costs of production are higher. It's already tough. You had a trade war, and it takes it to a whole nother level, one that could equal the farm crisis of the 1980s, of which was devastating to our farm economy. The farm economy is vital to the rural communities. They say a dollar in agriculture is turned over 6 to 8 times in the local community. That's hardware stores and small businesses. It impacts your schools, your churches, your community organizations, and a whole lot of the people that do the living and dying and working and playing across this country. Rural America is the backbone of the U.S. That also impacts the whole economy of this country in a dynamic way. When agriculture is struggling, it's hard for the economy of the U.S. to do well. And we're in a bad spot, and we're in a position where this could get much worse depending on the decisions made now. We need a level playing field, we need exports, we need certainty, and we need demand for our products in order to do well. And our rural communities are dependent on that.
Amen to that. I appreciate that, sir.
I thank my colleague and thank you for making those points with respect to healthcare and supply chains. That's a hugely important question. Senator Warnock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I agree with my Republican colleagues. Did y'all hear that? It's on the record.
Yes.
I agree with my Republican colleagues and even President Trump that bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States should be a bipartisan priority. And that's why I supported the Inflation Reduction Act, which has been a game changer in this country, certainly in my state of Georgia, where it's helped to create 42,000 clean manufacturing jobs across the state. These are good paying advanced manufacturing jobs of tomorrow that often don't require a college degree. But last week, I released this report that shows that these 42,000 Georgia jobs are at risk under the tax bill currently being rammed through Congress by Republicans. Without objection, I would like to enter my report.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Issacs, President Trump claims his tariffs will also bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States. Is he right? Will the president's tariffs on raw goods and component parts boost domestic manufacturing?
Targeted tariffs can play a role in incentivizing the reshoring of certain jobs or industries. But we think that they should be targeted and used strategically and supplemented by the positive agenda I've outlined in my testimony regarding tax and workforce development and the like.
So targeted and strategic is not words I'd use to describe this approach. Do you think these tariffs threaten the manufacturing boom we've seen in Georgia because of the IRA?
Well, I can't speak to the IRA, but with regard to the investments that have been accelerated under the CHIPS Act, I believe that they have the potential to increase costs of critical inputs that are required to maintain our competitiveness in fabrication and packaging and equipment and the like throughout the ecosystem.
God, it sounds like it could be a real drag, and we see evidence of that, a real drag on manufacturing by taxing these raw parts and components. We've seen, because of global supply chains, obviously we need to import raw goods and component parts from all over to complete that manufacturing here at home. We've seen this in Georgia with Hyundai, with Q-Cells. These tariffs make importing those raw materials and component parts incredibly expensive, making it even harder to boost American manufacturing and to create jobs. Dr. Baskaran, I don't want to butcher your name. The clean energy sector relies upon critical minerals, many of which are not available in the United States. Tell me, what will happen to industries that cannot access the critical minerals they need because of retaliatory measures or because the cost of importing them skyrockets due to tariffs?
Thank you, Senator. When we started this hearing, Senator Crapo pointed to dysprosium, and dysprosium is a really critical input for automotive manufacturing. People think it's just an EV battery. It's not. It's actually in the stereo system in every single car. These minerals are absolutely critical for the automotive manufacturing industry. I'm from Detroit, and when these tariffs were announced, one of the first things that we saw were a round of layoffs that were made. Ultimately, every time we see a supply chain disruption in minerals for automotives, regardless of what kind of automotive. When things get significantly more expensive, we've seen that people buy less cars when the economy is weak and when economic uncertainty is high. They undermine the competitiveness of these really critical industries. So we need to be very strategic about tariffs to ensure that we're not ultimately crippling the manufactured good, because we have to think about it from a mine to manufactured good perspective. And if there's a disruption, it ultimately hurts the end good.
Would it send prices up based on your background and experience on cars?
What about cars? Sorry.
Would these tariffs on raw materials send prices up for consumers?
100%. And I want to go to the EV, right? When I look at an internal combustion engine in the U.S., it uses about 33 kilograms of critical minerals. An electric vehicle uses 210 kilograms. It's a six-fold increase. We sometimes think that if the EV industry was to be competitive on its own, it would stand up in a free market. But China has used $230.9 billion of subsidies to BYD between 2009 and 2023. But now if you go to Mexico City and get in an Uber, it's probably a BYD, right? We have seen that it is a competitive global industry. Ensuring that we have competitive mineral inputs is critical to sustaining the competitiveness of GMs and Fords in this country and ensuring that we can sell internationally.
Thank you so much. Congressional Republicans are currently trying to repeal clean energy investments and threaten the more than 42,000 Georgians who are employed because of the IRA. Meanwhile, President Trump's chaotic and punitive tariffs are punishing companies that did the right thing and brought that manufacturing back to the United States because of the IRA by making parts and materials so expensive. This is, in my view, is a 1-2 gut punch to Georgia's clean manufacturing economy, and these tariffs are making us weaker and weakening our position in relationship to China and making us poor. And it's long past time for Congress to reclaim our power in the area of tariffs. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Senator Welch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ragland, I appreciated your comments earlier about the importance of the ag economy to rural America, actually all of America in my view. And we're getting hammered. You know, our dairy is our big product, but we've got a lot of vegetable growers. And our farmers get a lot of their fertilizer from Canada, and it's going to go up about 25%. And I don't care what the politics are of the farmer, whether they voted for Trump or they voted for Harris. That's a real hit, right? 25% more.
It's a massive hit, considering where the farm economy is already. 87% of our potash comes from Canada.
Right, so this is all across, especially the northern tier.
Yes, but it's even in Kentucky where I farm, that is a huge hit. Potash is one of the top 5 costs on my production list each year. We use a huge amount for production of our soybeans on our farm.
Right. And you know, some of the issues or the justification for tariffs are trying to get the supply chain back here, and I have some appreciation for that. But it's not like, you know, our crops, the more we grow here, the better, right? And we're already doing that. So we get higher costs. That is going to make those markets more vulnerable, right? And more farms are going to go out of business. By the way, on these tariffs, in the Midwest, where it's different crops, not a lot of dairy, but it's soy and wheat, and those farms in the round 1 of Trump tariffs, as I understand it, they lost international markets. Those are really important to the bottom line of those farms. So do you see that as an additional threat to the well-being of some of those commodity crop farms, that they'll lose markets because the void will be filled by other countries like Argentina and Brazil?
Absolutely, and we have the precedent from the first trade war. Before the 2018 trade war, 1 out of 3 rows of U.S. soybeans went to China.
Yeah.
We got down to nearly 1 out of 10 rows at the peak of the trade war.
Yeah.
And we have only got back to about 25% or 1 out of 4 rows. We have a gap we have never gained back.
So it's
and
not
it was
like you
picked up by
switch.
Brazil. Brazil went to being the #1 soy producer worldwide, and they are ready to take advantage of this trade war now and grab more of that.
Thank you for that.
We must have a level playing field.
Right. Thank you very much. And Dr. Baskaran, you know, the tariff authorities exist under Section 232 and 301, and those are prescribed approaches so that there's a hearing process and the upsides and downsides could be discussed and debated. People are going to be impacted, like, say, these Midwest farmers would be able to come in and say, hey, wait a minute, this is really going to hammer us, we'll lose our markets. But, of course, the president is using the so-called emergency authority, which I find a little bizarre because it's a national security threat that justifies imposing tariffs on that enormous threat to the well-being of Vermont, and that's an invasion from Canada. So a little bit of a stretch, I'd say. But just talk about how tariffs really make a difference in terms of whether they're thought out, where there's consideration of what the upsides and the downsides are versus the unilateral and arbitrary exercise of authority that the president seems to be justifying under the IEEPA.
Yeah, so 232 investigations are an interesting opportunity, Senator, because one of the challenges we've had in critical minerals policy is we continue to think of them as a homogeneous group of 55 minerals. And the vulnerabilities, where they're located, where our processing capabilities are very different. So disaggregating them, first of all, is a very good approach, I think, in terms of looking at what we need to be doing. The second point I would say is that strategic tariffs and not blanket are beneficial because we don't want to undermine the development of our own processing capabilities. If we are applying tariffs to raw ore, it simply becomes too expensive and commercially unviable. The difference between the United States and the West and China is that we have fiduciary responsibilities to our shareholders. Companies have an obligation to operate profitably, and ensuring that our tariff policies are congruent with ensuring these companies can operate profitably are critical. Otherwise, we're just continuing allowing China to dominate. So looking at it supply chain by supply chain, number one, and then two, looking at the various stages from raw ore processed, all the way through finished goods will be critical to ensuring that we don't cripple our long-term reindustrialization goals.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Senator Young.
Dr. Baskaran, the Chinese Communist Party isn't just exporting minerals, it's exporting leverage. By controlling the midstream choke points of global mineral processing and using that power to restrict exports of rare earth elements, Beijing is effectively turning raw materials into raw geopolitical pressure. America can't afford, in my estimation, to respond with vague policies or blanket tariffs. That's why I've introduced a strategic three-part legislative approach: the Finding Ore Act, the Critical Minerals Security Act, and the Strategic Minerals Act, to map global resources with a right of first refusal, to monitor supply chain risks, and to forge sector-specific free trade agreements with trusted partners. Even if we streamline permitting tomorrow, Dr. Baskaran, which is a much-needed priority, we'd still need international partnerships because the U.S. simply doesn't have every mineral under our feet. Dr. Baskaran, given these realities, do you believe this sector-specific approach in my Strategic Minerals Act is the right path to secure long-term supply?
Thank you, Senator. I think the sector-specific trade agreements are absolutely critical, and I want to commend you on a lot of the great work you've been doing. When we start back and think about exploration, identifying new deposits are absolutely critical, and ensuring those stay in allied hands is really important. One of the reasons China has excelled is they have taken the whole supply chain from exploration, mapping, exploration, production, and processing. For the U.S. to come in and excel, it needs to start at that early stage. I think that's important. Second, sector-specific trade agreements are important. As was earlier noted, it's not really the flavor of the decade to go to a free trade agreement as a whole, right. But we need to ensure that we are being targeted with our trade policies to our long-term vulnerabilities, because we see that China continues to weaponize them. The list just keeps getting longer. So absolutely, it's going to be many of the tools that you've highlighted.
Great, thank you. Too often it seems, Dr. Baskaran, that the conversation around critical minerals ends at the mine. Certainly many of our conversations here in Congress, and understandably so, many of our constituents are excited about accessing domestic minerals on account of the jobs it creates, and it just seems intuitively to make a lot of sense. But without refining, there is no supply chain, there is no value chain, and there is no utility for these rocks and other minerals we get out of the ground. The U.S. has made meaningful progress in growing domestic midstream capacity, but China still dominates globally, manufacturing over 90% of rare earths and graphite processing. That kind of concentration isn't just risky, it gives Beijing outsized influence over the global industrial base. Our allies, like Japan, have taken a more strategic approach, pairing public financing with enforceable offtake agreements to secure mineral access and build processing capacity abroad, locking in supply while supporting its industrial base. Dr. Baskaran, in your written testimony, you referenced Japan as a successful model. Could you expand on how a similar approach might work for the United States, and what you see as the most important steps Congress can take to develop midstream processing capacity without simply shifting the bottlenecks?
Thanks so much, Senator. You know, one of the things that made Japan so successful is where they use state funding, there's an offtake requirement that must go to Japanese companies. What we don't want to do in the United States is use DFC and use EXIM, both of which are up for reauthorization in 2025 and 2026, to fund projects that ultimately get signed over to Chinese processing. We've already seen it with Serra Verde, which has been shortlisted as a heavy rare earths project by the U.S.-led Mineral Security Partnership, that in the New York Times recently came out that they've signed their long-term offtake agreement over to China. That is actually quite self-defeating for our use of taxpayer resources. What we want to do is ensure that where we're using government financing, it's aligned, a percentage of it is coming back either through guaranteed offtake or discounted offtake to U.S. companies. This is how we start to take the mine-to-market supply chain. So aligning our financing with our offtake agreements.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I have to yield back. I also have a med device question that I'd love to pose to Mr. Whitaker, but I am at the end of my time.
Well, we will let you ask that question, and then Senator Wyden has one more question as well, and then we will wrap up.
Yeah, just very briefly, Mr. Whitaker.
Yes, sir.
On this question of supply chains and healthcare. One of the things that I think we learned during the pandemic and the aftermath of how to deal with this in the future is that it's pretty hard for you all to act like that with the snap of the fingers. You do an amazing job moving very quickly. But I think it would be helpful if you could give us some kind of inkling of some of the challenges when you can't snap your fingers and why it's so important we get this fixed now, which means also coming up with a tariff approach that's targeted and sensible and not like this mess we've got in our hands today.
It's a great question, Senator. The reason we can't act quickly is because our supply chains are very complicated. They're distributed all over the world. Resources that we need to access are distributed and manufactured all over the world. And as a result of that, it's impossible to build a technology that might have 250, 300 different component parts in one location at the snap of a finger. Even if we wanted to do that, and even if we tried to do that, the regulatory process that's required to set up and manufacture a single product in a single site takes a long time to go through, and for good reason. You want to make sure that you have good manufacturing practices. You want to make sure the product is safe. You want to make sure it continues to be effective. So it's virtually impossible for us to relocate everything without going through a meaningful regulatory process as well, which means we need a diverse supply chain, and we need to pull products from a lot of different parts of the world in order to execute the agreements we have to provide those products to hospitals.
Let's put this in the to be continued department. I think it's extraordinarily serious because if you don't get this right, as I touched on earlier, people can get really sick and also die. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Look forward to that.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. And I'm going to yield my final opportunity for a question.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, well, thank you. And I'll make it highly abbreviated because the good Senator Wyden basically laid a predicate for my question of Mr. Whitaker. And this might be a harmonious moment of bipartisan interest in the med device industry, so that we can explore together, Senator Wyden, how to optimize our trade enforcement tools for an industry that is really important to my state and to the health and well-being of so many Americans, but also highly regulated and life critical. So I guess, Mr. Whitaker, are there particular things that we should be thinking about as policymakers to take into account the life-critical and highly regulated nature of your industry when designing or considering trade enforcement tools?
Right. So first of all, I would answer it this way. Broad tariff policy is not constructive relative to that. Targeted tariff policy, as many of our colleagues have said, could be constructive relative to certain component parts. But I would put it in three broad categories from a broad policy standpoint. Tax policy matters a lot relative to manufacturing in the United States. A low corporate tax rate, appropriate incentives, R&D incentives in the tax code matter a lot in order to relocate our products here and continue to build here. Secondly, regulatory policy matters. Regulations are important, but if they're not expedited and it's a slow process, it's very difficult for us. And third, reimbursement policy matters as well. Other countries are very careful about reimbursing products that are built in their country for their country at a rate that's better than ours.
I see.
We don't do that in our country, and we need to. And I'll give you one more thing. The breakthrough legislation that you've introduced for medical technologies will make a huge difference in U.S.-made manufacturing products coming to market more quickly. It incentivizes growth, it incentivizes jobs, and it's good for the healthcare system.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Young. And as you've seen, we've been joined by another senator, Senator Blackburn. And so, Senator Blackburn, you'll go next. And then if no other senator shows up, we'll do a wrap-up and we will then finish.
Thank you. And I want to thank each of you for being here. This is, when we talk about supply chains and the work that is being done and the importance there, I appreciate that each of you would be here to talk with us. Last week, Senators Bennett, Tillis, Coons, and I filed the Semi-Investment Act, and this deals with the semiconductor industry and makes certain that you're going to be able to use the advanced manufacturing tax credit for this issue. Supply chains are vitally important, and in Tennessee, we have a lot of auto manufacturing. We have a good bit of appliance manufacturing, and many people don't think about entertainers and road crews and concerts and the amount of manufacturing that is done there with amplifiers and microphones and the staging equipment that goes into those events. So supply chains for us in Tennessee, whether it's the logistics side, and Memphis has the Port of Memphis. It has all 5 Class A railroads. It has FedEx. So we are a hub there. When you look at the manufacturing and the entertainment and also as we look at healthcare, and Nashville being a true center for healthcare IT. This is something that is important to us, and we pay attention to what is happening with our adversaries, and I classify that as Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And Mr. Issacs, as we look at the strategic investments that somebody like China is putting across the entire semiconductor value chain, can you speak to how the Semi Act would be important for domestic manufacturing?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. We appreciate your leadership in introducing that legislation. The goal of this effort was always to build out the entire ecosystem, and that starts with materials, inputs, and equipment, as well as fabrication. We need to be doing that whole stack, and so your legislation would incentivize, extend the existing advanced manufacturing investment credit to cover materials, and we think that could be an important part of building out our ecosystem. I'd also take a moment to clarify a comment I made to the chairman in response to his question. The current advanced manufacturing investment credit currently covers semiconductor manufacturing and equipment manufacturing, and what we're suggesting it be extended to include research and design. And Senator Blackburn's bill would cover materials as well.
And we think that would be important. Mr. Whitaker, we do a lot of medical device manufacturing in Tennessee. Down in Shelby County, 1 in every 4 jobs is linked to medical devices. And a lot of these businesses that are in that supply chain and with different components, things of that nature, they are small to mid-size business. And these companies rely on a very complex global supply chain. I think you've all, as I've listened to your hearing, you all have talked a good bit again about this. And one of the things we want to do is make certain that we're guarding against disruptions.
Right.
Because it's important that we continue to build some diversity into these supply chains. It is important that we have access to all of those inputs. You all have talked about rare earth minerals. You've talked about these critical elements. And we've got one Tennessee company in particular that has worked tirelessly to reposition their entire supply chain and their global footprint because of what they went through during COVID.
Right.
And they didn't want to be relying on overseas suppliers that were maybe in disruptive areas. Mm-hmm. And I think this is kind of a strategic shift toward more resilience in our supply chains. And it is an effort that we need to put some energy and some focus onto. So what more can we do when we talk about building in that resiliency for these inputs in a supply chain for something like medical devices?
Yeah, Senator, it's a great question, and you do have great companies in Tennessee. I would say 80% of all U.S. medical technology companies are small companies, small businesses who aren't profitable today, but they're the engine that drives innovation for many of the large companies as they're bringing new products and innovative products to market. I think there are tax policies, we can have a longer conversation about that are beneficial to small companies particularly. I think the tariffs, to come back to this point, for any small company that may have made strides in moving products back into the United States, but still have to access products from other parts of the country or other parts of the world, I should say. Right. A 10% increase, a 15, 20% increase hits their bottom line quickly, and it hits it very, very hard. And my concern is the small businesses get hit hardest first in the medical technology industry. So exempting medical technology products from the tariffs in the short term would be a huge benefit for small companies, mid-sized companies, and large companies as well. And can I add, we've never really experienced tariffs before in the medical technology industry. Across the board, they've been 0 to 1 to 2%. So any increase domestically or overseas is an increased cost to our companies. Countries have recognized for years the value of what we do, the humanitarian nature of the work we do, the impact on cost to the healthcare system, and as a result, we haven't experienced that. So we would hope going forward we wouldn't see that experience in the future as well.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So here's how we're going to proceed. We do believe that one senator still may show up, but Senator Wyden and I are going to give some brief closing remarks, and then if that senator is not here yet, we will wrap up. If he is, he'll be getting the last remarks. Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be brief. So we've been sitting here for several hours, and my take is that the Trump tariff policies are delivering a double whammy that is hammering the American people. Let me just give you my sense of how I reached that judgment. The Trump tariffs are not just unhelpful. They are actually threatening critical supply chains, and they're doing it by driving up costs, by closing out export markets, and making it impossible to essentially invest and plan for the future. And that harms the creation of jobs, and it harms innovation. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is essentially tearing down the policies that do bring about investment in manufacturing in our country. And we see that with both semiconductors and energy, where, in effect, policies that are working today, as you all have told us, are being pulled out by the roots, and apparently there's going to be little or nothing. And, for example, in the area of the clean energy tax credits, where I worked on it for almost a decade, we're going to miss the chance if it goes through in this form, and we're going to push very hard to keep it from proceeding that way. But if it does, we're going to jack up energy prices. We're going to make it harder to reshore. Our country is going to needlessly suffer. So your work in terms of chips, clean energy, looking at federal funding for science and research, I think you're on the right side of history. And I thank all of you. And it's ironic that you all offered us an assessment that was pretty similar. And I'm going to use it with my colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, because I think it's the right thing to do. The best politics is good policy. So we thank you. We're going to be calling on you often in the days ahead, and we appreciate your input very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. And I, too, want to thank our witnesses. I think that all of you have presented very solid and helpful information to us about our supply chains and the needs for us to get it right. There's really not a lot of disagreement on the notion that we need to get a targeted tariff regime, and we need to end non-tariff trade barriers. The playing field is not balanced. The United States is discriminated against in many different ways by many different countries, And the effort that President Trump is undertaking right now is aimed at balancing that field. But like I say, we all understand that the objective here is to eliminate non-tariff trade barriers, to balance the trade field, and let us have actual fair trade globally. There's some pain in getting there. We all hope that we get there, and you have all described how you think that ought to look. And I personally agree with the descriptions you've given of how it ought to look when we get there. With that being said, I expect and hope that this committee will work together as we move forward on a bipartisan basis to find some solutions along the lines of those you have suggested here, and focus on making America as strong as we possibly can with regard to critical supply chains. And your input has been very helpful in that regard. Seeing no other senator here, I would like to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. Your insights into the complexity of our supply chains will be top of mind as we continue our conversations on trade and tax. And I remind my colleagues that the deadline for submitting any questions for the record is 5 p.m. next Wednesday, May 21st. And with that, the Finance Committee stands adjourned. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you.